Thank you everyone for coming. We are going to do a couple polls throughout this morning, but overall, if you want in the chat to let me know where you're calling in from or dialing in from, that would be great, just so I have a sense of what state everyone is either working in or calling in from. That would be fantastic. And then we're also going to stop and do polls and questions. Let me give you a little background. So I've had a farm here in upstate New York for almost 20 years. I've sort of generally had a mixed, I started with sort of the homestead operation and realized, you know, okay, I'm not going to quit my day job here, and ended up founding a commercial green roof plant nursery. So I basically spent almost 10 years in another niche specialty business, which had to do with producing a bunch of specialized plants that go on the top of roofs in our urban areas, largely in the Northeast. So long story short, it was clearly time to get out of that business in 2014, 2015. I sold the business, but I wanted to keep my farm, and kind of looked around and saw that there were these ground mounted solar arrays, and there are just a couple of them at the time. I'm not far from Cornell University, which has a lot of land grant land and was starting to build out ground mounted solar, and had another small solar company putting in little 5-acre solar arrays around. I thought, well, this is interesting. And then I came to understand exactly how much solar was expected for New York. And I realized, there's an opportunity here to do something like what they were doing in the United Kingdom and what they were doing in North Carolina. So I just want to start with that. And today I'm going to take us through like a couple different tranches of information, kind of like the why of solar grazing a little at the beginning. Then I'm going to move into a little bit of background on where the solar industry is now and where it's headed in the United States. And then I'll move into some of the mechanics of how people are operating at different solar sites, who some of the players are, and what some of the tools are that we've created at ASGA, the American Solar Grazing Association. So with that, I'm gonna share screen, and there you go. Here we go. So, and if anyone's desperately, wants to ask questions at any point, you really can just interrupt me. It's fine. So let's see. Here we go. Great. So fundamentally, I define solar grazing as grazing livestock to manage vegetation at solar arrays. Sheep really are the livestock that are best suited to your standard ground mounted, meaning attached to the ground, not attached to the roof of a building, photovoltaic or PV solar. That's as opposed to, say, solar hot water or solar concentrated solar power, solar PV. So just like in the picture there are some solar modules, and there's some racking that they stand on, and then they're screwed into the ground. And that ground is what's interesting to me. And then that fence, which you can see in the back of the picture, was also of interest to me and quite a few others. So something you should know is that this happens all over the world now. Not true when I was getting started with this, but true now that Australia, South America, Europe, and little touches of this absolutely happening in China. So the United States is part of a global movement here to go back to the land with some land management with livestock. So a couple of the high level, like, why are we doing this? And if you're all livestock producers, I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is also, I kind of divide my time between educating the solar industry on why using livestock makes sense at their solar arrays. And then I turn around and I'm talking to the farmers about what we can do to partner with the solar. So I'm thinking you're mostly the farmers. So fundamentally, sheep do fit under the panels. The height of the solar racking and the height, how far they've been built and engineered to be off the ground is not standard. It's not standard across the industry. It's not standard even across a single project. So by and large, sheep fit under the panels. And that is the hardest part to maintain if you're a human being and you're trying to cut vegetation and keep it from growing up between the panels or onto the panels. That's our advantageous point here. Now, point two is if we're trying to sell ourselves as we are businesses managing, an asset, managed grazing keeps the sun on the panels. That's what the solar companies need. That's what their contracts and performance is entirely about. If they want to be able to write checks, they have to know they've got a performance guarantee there on the sun on the panels. Okay, the third is, I see it, and I'm starting to have more scientific documentation at solar arrays of, okay, with managed grazing and this, the right ingredients, we can get biodiversity gains. There are not really yet standards in the United States to reward solar companies for having broader goals. There's a little bit, but land management at solar is in its infancy. Lastly, these farmer partnerships. When you hang your farm sign on the gate of a solar array, that really says something to the community. And it also you become the face of that arrangement. I am the person in my community here in the Finger Lakes that people know, oh, they're Lexie sheep. And you have a question, about how the solar works or what's happening at the solar array. They come to me. They don't call the solar company, they call me. So what solar companies get out of this is a lasting relationship in the community and on the ground. So more broadly, as the alternative to solar grazing and other kinds of agricultural co-location with solar, this is all under the field of agrivoltaics, dual use solar. Basically, it is the idea that we're going to have different layers of use of the land, and we're going to try and, think through how to then maximize this wherever possible. The two most prevalent forms of dual use solar in the United States are the solar grazing and a class called pollinator friendly solar, around which there is a body of legislation, and depending on which state you're in, you may have to kind of work to comply with that, including requirements around planting only native species. So just know that is the other area where there tends to be some kind of regulatory body and oversight. So as you can kind of see then, the pollinator friendly vegetation, the picture at the bottom is a solar site up in Ontario near Ottawa. And one thing that can also be harmonious, and I've tried to really work hard to bridge the gap here between only pollinators or only sheep, or anyway, I'll get into the third camp, is this solar beekeeping. So beekeeping at solar, I try and encourage and foster as another practice that sort of supports our mutual goals. Lastly, the alternative is frankly just turf grasses and mowing at solar arrays. So literally big lawns. So I pulled some language here. I'm not going to go into all of it, but I pulled some language here from Acciona. Acciona is actually, like most of these firms, it's a renewables firm that came mostly out of the wind industry and is now building solar as well. It happens to be European. I'd say a reasonable number of these firms are European in origin. And just so you know, there are a set of goals that the solar companies expect, which is why I included this slide. So in a little more detail than the previous slide, that shading of the panels, not something that we can tolerate. So we've got to think hard about vegetation heights, growth, etc. Then we think about encroachment. What they're saying with this is there is some equipment, depending on the site, that can move. There are drive rods, there are some hydraulics you might recognize from your tractor. Certainly like twining vines might come up and twist and prevent operation of that equipment. There's also some other equipment I'll show you later that it's pretty expensive, and we kind of need to keep vegetation from like clouding its function. There is typically an invasive species mandate around the land management, typically in the environmental permitting documents. There is some guidance that the solar firms are supposed to follow around at least like having a plan for control and prevention. Worker safety is kind of a big one. If you're here in the West, absolutely, or well, anywhere, you have to have vegetation maintained at a level where, you know, a worker can walk through that solar site and pick up a panel and unscrew it if they need to. The other thing is, and I've been to solar sites all throughout the Southeast where, you know, poisonous snakes are a real factor, and workers like to be able to see placing their foot 1 foot in front of the other. And we can get into some more things, but fire risk is really, you know, in the Western US, the #1 thing that people are thinking about in the solar industry, controlling, reducing fire risk. And I will say that I have definitely worked with solar grazers who have won over their contract because, you know, my point is sheep don't throw rocks. They don't kick up rocks that then can spark. And these arrays are very expensive and can burn. So we want to prevent that. And so just lastly on the bottom, overall, you know, just know that if you do get into this, you know, you're not at your home farm anymore. So absolutely how tidy the site looks is important. Reducing costs, we've got to be reasonably competitive is what I'm going to say about that. And then lastly, those other items, carbon footprint, soil organic matter, sustainability. There's not a lot of rewards yet. The solar farms I'm not seeing them kind of jump on that. I think that's going to be increasingly important. Okay, so I have a few slides here to give you some interest in the solar, like background of what's happening in the solar industry and kind of why this is a big deal. Lynn, this is a place I could stop for a minute if you wanted to throw a poll up. I don't know if you can do that.
Yep, sure thing. 1 second.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna share my screen.
Do you want me to stop share?
I think it will let me do it over you. And the box. All right. I'm sorry, this is the first time I'm using this. It looks like you have to go to the link that's if everyone can go, if you hover over the words at the top, where it will give you the link to the menti.com where the poll happens, and then the results should pop up here.
Okay, cool. Should I kind of chat a little about what's happening in the solar industry while people take the poll?
Might as well. Additionally, look, folks, if you are having trouble with that, you can always drop your answers in the chat.
Cool. I think we'll give people a minute. This is just meant to give me a sense of how many sheep people are in the audience already. Oh, here we go. Nice. Good. Yeah, this is great. Okay, some sheep, some cattle. Cattle, okay. So I'll make sure I kind of cover a little then of cattle and solar in a little bit here. The short answer on it right now is that no one's that's very much in the, I sort of had the two slides that the slides that showed, you know, solar beekeeping, solar, you know, pollinators and sheep. Those are the predominant land use. I was estimating it's, you know, we're easily at 12, you know, above 12, maybe 12 to 15,000 acres of solar grazing with sheep. I think cattle, we're at 3 acres. You know, there's a really challenging set of engineering around that. Okay, so Lynn, why don't I keep going?
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, Greg. Okay. I don't agree, Greg. Happy to talk more, but it does depend a little. Okay, so just a little background on what's going on with the solar industry. And the two bits that I want you to kind of pay attention to here, and I'm going to get into the weeds of this a little bit for a minute, is the pale blue, and I'm sorry the Osgo logo ended up in the middle of this one, the pale blue and the green, which are the top upper sections. Those are the ones that we're really interested in. We're not that interested in the yellow. We're not interested in the dark blue. And I am just starting, I actually just got the breakout numbers of just the other two colors for us alone. But fundamentally what's happening, and you can see that starting in, you know, here I was in 2015, 2016, okay, looking at this industry. And here we are at 2021. The fundamental thing, and it says here on the right, is, you know, there's been some federal tax credits. It's this.
Lexie, sorry, we can't see your screen.
Oh, sorry. I forgot about, oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, thank you. Okay. Appreciate it. Okay, so just basically the big pale blue at the top, and then the green right below it is what we are interested in. But fundamentally, you see this growth trajectory, okay? And the real thing driving this, yes, there was the federal tax credit, but really is declining costs. And we're going to see, I think there's going to be a little hiccup now, but I think fundamentally we're going to be looking at basically there's sort of like, we're heading towards this like idea of market parity with solar. So the costs are coming down so dramatically in the past 5 years that even if you're in a state where it's, you know, the policies are fundamentally a little unfriendly to solar, there's not a regulation, there's not a sort of incentive structure, there's not an agency helping reward companies, you're still going to see solar. It's that the market is that good, things have gotten that cheap. So that and energy demand is that consistent or high. So here you are, the cost to install solar has dropped by more than 70%. So you're kind of seeing, you know, what people predicted years ago and were hopeful of, but you're seeing solar be competitive with, you know, natural gas and other standard generation, fossil generation, and outcompete wind. And so what's could have happened is that, you know, solar companies are getting rapidly staffed from, you know, if they had anyone on their wind side, you know, great. Those are often solar developers are often coming in with another wind background, but they may also just be coming in from anywhere else in the energy industry. So that is absolutely something I'm seeing, is, you know, people, traditional fossil only producers are developing solar segments, you know, in a heartbeat. And I expect that trend to continue, despite there are some trade war tariff issues, but I think we're just headed out there. This is to give you a sense of kind of who's put in the most. And you know, we've got California out there as the real leader, and you know, Texas and Florida absolutely continue to be real leaders. I should say that overall, like, this is very much a state by state build out, and there has been a lack of federal policy. And so what has happened is certain states, and Minnesota and New York and Massachusetts and New Jersey are examples of them, kind of put out incentives to build out renewables, even though they have half the sunshine of your Texas or Florida. So, you know, it takes a developer twice as long, potentially, you know, much more time to earn back on their return. So you have these states that have been leaders. You have other states that have had no incentive, Texas and Florida, where it's literally just, and very, very little permitting. So they built out a lot of solar quite quickly. And the other thing that's tricky about all this is understanding kind of the nature of utilities and how our transmission systems work. And there's a whole like world of this that I'm just going to say it's complicated, and I'm happy to kind of talk to one of you individually if you have questions, but just know that, you know, one side of the state line may not look like the other side of the state line, and that may continue. I do not really expect there to be a federal bill that kind of drives things and cleans this up. Okay, this is my map based on literally just cumulative data of who our members are, where people are operating, and where there's solar grazing in 2021. I've been making this map for 3 years. I've been watching the expansion of the number of states. I would say that in some cases we're teetering, you know, plus or minus by one solar array. You know, you might have one array. In other cases, you know, New York, Florida, Georgia, lots of solar arrays and lots of grazing. So just note also that I would expect Iowa and Washington to join us fairly soon. Maybe Delaware. Okay, I'm going to do a minute here on vocabulary because I'm now going to go into some education around, you know, when you're talking to developers, you're going to want to understand some of this. Again, there is really no federal regulation here, so I'm going to do my best to sort of generally give you the vocabulary you're going to need if you're going to get into this as like a business part of your business. So, of the ground-mounted solar, ground-mounted PV, there's two classes. One is very big, which is utility scale or grid scale solar. The other class of solar, which is smaller, community scale, community solar, or direct generation, or DG. I'm sorry, it's complicated. It's the nature of the beast. So, and I'll drop down a little and just say that in general, grid scale, utility scale is about 100 acres or more. That community scale or DG, it's typically under 100 acres, but usually 5 acres, or, you know, 5 acres is sort of the minimum, roughly. In the middle, as grazers, what you're going to want to know about is acres. What the developers talk in is megawatts. Further, you're going to want to talk about fenced acreage because they fence around the solar, and they will not necessarily know that. I use software to calculate acreage for our grazing program. For my grazing business, I absolutely use, there's a couple different, you know, you can go in through like a pasture map, you can go into Google Earth, you can change some of the settings, but I absolutely calculate the acres they're expecting me to manage. So when you're working with these developers, you should at least like kind of know that if it's less than about 15 megawatts or less, you're going to be in that DG community scale range. If you're talking grid scale, it's probably 20 megawatts. it might be 300 or 400 megawatts. Grid scale solar is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I just, in the past 2 months, I've now been called in to talk to people about 2 projects, each of which were upwards of 18,000 acres. Okay, here's a little more of the growth forecast. Here's our forecast, is basically what you all should just know for a sec. Again, we're interested in this pale blue for utility scale. And then again, here's our community solar vocabulary. That's our trend. Here it comes, and you see on the left are megawatts, DC megawatts versus AC. Oh, I did forget on the last slide, just quickly, when I'm working with developers and I'm trying to do like quick math, I would say it's about 6 or 7 acres to 1 megawatt. Roughly, there are some factors that contribute to this, like terrain and technology. Sort of lastly, I'm just going to say here, where are you in the country? This is, and then Lynn, after this, in a minute or two, let's do our next slide, please. Which states kind of, where's the action here is sort of the question. And it's sort of saying, well, there's others, but, you know, community scale, which is again, probably less than 100 acres, the dominant players in the market for community scale are the states on the bottom: New York, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Maine, New Jersey, Illinois, which I expect a lot more growth in, Colorado, and Maryland. Little bits in other states. And then lastly, and you should know this came out of, like, I think the Sunshot report, lot coming out of the Biden administration. Long story short, lots more solar coming, and there's a bunch of sort of wrangling within the industry to try and understand how they can even reach the goals of kind of 30 by 30 or 30% by 2040, 40% so, to meet overall US market demand. So this is where we are on the growth chart, which is yellow versus the blue, which is like where the administration wants us to be. So just kind of hold on to your hats here. All right, Lynn, this would be a great time to ask that second poll if you can.
Hey, I'm so sorry. I just X'd it out by accident when I opened it. It'll take me too long to get back in there, but if everyone in the chat could just write where they're grazing at, so Lexie could have a sense of what's going on there.
Awesome. I'm not actually sure I can see that. Oh, there's the chat.
Or feel free to just take yourself off mute and chime in too. That's fine.
Nice. Okay. Mexico, California. Okay.
Michigan.
Michigan is also getting, as you're probably hearing, a bunch of grid scale solars projected for Michigan, especially the lower peninsula. New Mexico, some coming. It's ironic, actually, some of those Southwest states, it's actually too hot for optimal solar performance. So although there's going to be plenty more installed in the desert, I think actually that's part of why developers are going north. I was just looking at a big project in Washington State yesterday, so the panels actually perform better, at about, I think it's like 80 degrees. It's sort of their optimal. All right, cool. I'm going to stick with this. I work, one of the things we do with our membership, just so you know, is we do like talks to educate them, and because there's a lot to kind of understand about this, just so you can kind of appropriately price your bids and also just kind of know what you're getting involved in. And I'm working increasingly more with firms at the front end, planning for the grazing with their projects, especially as projects are getting bigger. It's more and more important, and it's more and more important to have folks like you kind of joining us, because you're going to be experienced with the grazing and the grazing management and the land management. That's the area of tends to be the weak side for our solar friends. Okay, So Invenergy is a major US utility scale solar developer, as well as other renewables. Recently, one of their solar engineers gave us a talk. I thought he had some good slides, and so I've got a couple here to share. The sort of the two things you should know is we've got our fixed racking systems, which is the picture on the top. Those solar panels do not move. And then we have our tilted, our single axis tracker or tracker systems, a single axis. So the little trick here is that the steeper the hillsides that the solar is going in on, the more likely you are to see that fixed racking, which if you're a grazer also tells you, oh, I'm gonna have areas that the sheep need to get underneath with, and I'm gonna have to manage around that. It also helps inform some of what you end up thinking about with the wire handling and management. So I'll hopefully get to. The bottom picture is, it's a next tracker. It actually works independent. Each row works independently with this brand of solar. But what they're sort of saying is that they do site work, they do grading. There's definitely plans for grading. And there's actually another kind of tracker where you actually they level the ground in like terraces, picture like rice paddies. They're actually leveling whole sections at a time. So because there are drive rods that move all the solar in one power block at a time. So long story short, that's why the pictures of the cut and fill diagrams at the bottom. But just know that there can be site work and earthwork. Folks tend to want to save money and do less of that. And that can be good news, again, for grazers over mowing equipment, because it means there can be more rough terrain, more rocks, more things that would sort of bog down, and something that gives you an advantage when you're bidding on your project. This is just a couple, again, thank you, Invenergy, but here's just a couple on the typical pile types. So people kind of think, oh, there must be a lot of concrete used. Not typically. These ballasted systems, which is the center picture, are fairly unusual except at brownfield developments. So literally some kind of Superfund site, or increasingly in New England, it's there's incentives for developers on old landfills. So ballasted is very, very hard to mow around. There's nothing can be buried. None of the collection lines can be buried. So our grazers can have an advantage. Otherwise, there tend to be basically different kinds of ground screws that are actually screwed in, and everything is GPS coordinated, and there are special machines that screw them in. Lastly, there are some that are kind of either pre-driven piles. They tend to be kind of like I-beams. So if it's solid rock, they will pre-drill or try to drive piles in. It will depend on how the geotechnical studies go. I don't even get into height so much, but here's a picture of our pile driver planting solar into potentially a cornfield. And so there's a whole process and a multi-year development process, so that just so you know, the developers are kind of trying to understand the characteristics of the soil, looking at floodplains and factors that inform the eventual both type of solar they use. The height of the racking is the key. It's informed by all these studies that they pay to do first. If there happens to be a flooded area, you might get a very, very tall set of solar over the whole array, or maybe just sections of it. If not, you might get solar that's coming really close to the ground these days. And that can be really challenging for mowers to manage. It can also be challenging for sheep to manage. Not the sheep themselves, but us to manage with the sheep. The price of steel right now means that a bunch of new developments are being planned lower and lower to the ground. Kind of lastly, you know, there is hydrology testing. I'm not going to get into this too much, but this does happen. It can be very, very wet. Remember that solar is often targeted, and there are places like American Farmland Trust that are trying to guide solar development there are more and more solar siting criteria so that the solar goes on the marginal lands, which might look like this, and yet vegetation is going to grow. So it becomes a little bit of a puzzle. All right, I'm going to show you some pictures and switch gear again. And this is a little bit more of like, now I'm getting into like what the grazers need to know and less of the solar industry education and technology education. You should know that either I probably took most of the pictures you'll see, and if I didn't, maybe some of our members did. Just to give you a sense at the top, this is a not abnormal thing to have the racking jutting out from below these modules, and they're pretty easy to catch yourself on, and they can be quite close to the ground. You can see in the picture where the sheep are napping in the bottom right there, that array was designed in a way to keep the panels level. And what it means is sometimes the racking is 6 inches off the ground and sometimes it's 7 feet off the ground. And you can see in the other picture, just kind of a more standard solar site built to accommodate snow loads. So actually that leading edge of the panel, which we'd like to see in the more northern states, is above 30 inches. It's typically more like 32 to 36 inches the further north you get. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit on some more vocabulary for you. Not going to do tons, but just know that there are some things that basically help turn once the photons are collected. There's a whole bunch of, there's some like processing equipment that sort of amalgamates all these electrons and sort of transforms them and from DC to AC and so on and so forth, and then eventually gets them right onto the grid. These are inverters. You see the yellow thing, that's an inverter. They'll have like little banks of inverters. Just knowing that those are there. We do safety tours. There's a bunch of safety, but knowing that's something, for example, that you as a grazer will want to keep that area clear and make sure you manage it particularly well if possible. Also know it's something you don't want to touch, and also know it's something where I've been asked by the solar operations techs to go read an error code for them. Hey, Lexie, could you go down and I think there might be an error. Could you just go down and look at that code? Because they know I'm on site or close by for the whole grazing season. They're happy to ask me, and it saves them from sending someone else there if they're far away. The other big thing to know is that here's our equipment pads, our other bigger inverters and our bigger transformers. This is a pretty fancy exclusion. If you look at this kind of like Tartar style pipe gates, the solar company happened to put this one in. I tend to use more like something I find at Tractor Supply. That said, it is a key thing to keep your sheep off of the equipment pads. Not because the sheep will necessarily cause any trouble, but because the equipment techs really dislike finding sheep poop on their pads, and because the dried poop can get into your intake fins and actually accelerate the aging of the equipment and increase operational costs. So that's just my big message, is if there's areas where those electrical techs are working, let's just exclude them. And that's probably at most solar sites, that's the only concrete you're going to find. I just wanted to show you, we have excellent perimeter fencing at many of our solar sites. This is a federal regulation, one of the few for the solar industry. The picture on the left is one at a solar site in Ontario, where the farmer actually did a bunch of research, was already a grazer. He had the luck to work with the firm and put in these serious coyote-proof fences. I'm showing it to you because it's an outstanding example of coyote proofing. They're not always so good. You can see a picture on the right that I kind of took where I'm adding a little bit of that hog panel to a gate to make sure that there's no chance for a neighborhood dog or coyote to slip through that gap. I don't think I get into it too much, but just note that as your areas, I was just in Kansas actually. I was talking to a county there about they wanted to put in wildlife friendly fencing. Well, wildlife friendly fencing can be the kind of the bane of a solar grazer, because that can mean that they're raising the fences up 18 inches off the ground. They still have those nice posts, and they might still have that nice chain link or agricultural fence. They might raise it up to 1 or 2 feet and let all those coyotes right in. So when you're working with, to get into this, be sure to help, with good information. Okay, couple things. Which solar can be grazed? I kind of say most broadly, all types of solar. But in terms of informing cost, absolutely, you're going to see right here that there are some technologies that are going to be easier for a landscaper to compete with us. That would be the picture on the bottom left. You can see those are symbol like I-beams versus the racking overhead, as well as this sort of 4-post, I think it's called a K style system, that is pretty challenging for them to mow around. It's also, that happens to be a fairly wet site that we graze. Also know that, this tough terrain, all of these pictures are in the Northeast, Massachusetts, New York. This tough terrain is absolutely where our sheep can outperform and provide like much safer operation space than a maintenance firm who might be sending in, our competition otherwise as people with weed eaters. And then kind of lastly, you can sort of see here, this is my, when you go out and when you're bidding on these arrays, bring a measuring tape and look at the height of this leading edge of the panels. When the panels are in their sort of stow position, or, their dawn or dusk position, just get a sense of how many inches that is. So 20 inches for this project site. Okay. That means when you're planning for your vegetation management, that you should, once the vegetation is going to start shading at 20 inches or maybe 19 inches. So you're going to have to think of a rotation and have enough stock density to get around the site in time to keep the vegetation below that height. Just know, that utility scale is going to present a bunch of challenges to scale up people's grazing operations to match the size of the solar projects. The projects in the background here are all between 500 and 600 acres. And these are ones in Florida that are, they're building them, 3 a year. So that's a lot of grazing to add to your portfolio quickly, especially in an eastern state with a lot of rain. Thinking about ways to make a big project small, getting a contract for a section of the project to start a pilot, looking at whether you can mow and graze. These are all ways to kind of blend these operations together and maybe have a shot, because it takes a lot to mow these sites as well. Also kind of note, I included this as well, there's some wire management you can see down the center of that row where there's some dangling wires. Absolutely take a look at what is going on with these little wires, and whether you think your flock will be safe around them, or whether or not someone needs to take some zip ties and tie them up. That should not be you. But that would be sort of a condition of contract. Okay, which solar can be grazed here? What I'm seeing is, in both cases, these are different farmers in upstate New York who are branching out from their other farm businesses. And in fact, what's happening in the Northeast is they're taking over from dairy. The guy on the left is a dairy farmer who sold the last of his cows this spring, produces, I don't know, several thousand acres of hay every year, he tells me, and I forget. But and he's now doing all grass-fed lamb and a little bit of some other livestock. But he's getting into this. He's got the infrastructure. He's got the barns. So does the grazer on the right. She also is managing the grazing with sort of an intensive rotation, and she's leasing adjacent dairy barns in order to have enough space for her use in the winter. Just so you know, he uses Katahdins and she uses Texels. I have pictures here to just say, thinking about how to scale up, because the solar industry has a little bit of a head start on the grazing community here. And just know that some of our bigger practitioners, and now I am trying to, scale up. I think every year for the past few years, we keep like doubling the amount of land we're managing. Well, so just know, thinking about how to stay in compliance is very important. And you can see that along the leading edge. We mowed just the leading edge of those panels. And you can also see on the right, I used an example of, it's Eli Valdez's company that definitely do a mow and graze model, because they're also sort of doubling the size of their operation every year in Texas. Just sort of giggling a little here at the competition, or just knowing how challenging mowing at solar sites can be. The reason I put that picture up on the left of the guy on the red Toro is because that's the image that, a lot of the solar firms have in their mind when they're going to build their sites. Like, oh, this will be easy. We'll just get some big mowers. It's not so easy. And so just, you all will know much more so that the reality is much more challenging. And you stick sort of a bunch of obstacles kind of in the way, and the big mowers have a harder time. There is a little bit emerging in the way of battery mowers. I do know of a couple firms investing in them. Apparently they have up to about 125, 150 acres they're supposed to be able to mow. So far, I've heard they're not working very well. We'll see, but just know that is yet another form of potential competition. And lastly, something, there are two sides sort of here to this herbicide use. The standard, many of the solar companies, don't want to be seen as, spraying a lot. The pictures I took on the top two photos were both in North Carolina. Kind of a lot of herbicide use, which then contributes to, of course, other soil and erosion problems. And it depends, again, which state you're in. The solar company may or may not have state level regulation that will stop that level of blanket spraying under the panels and all along the fence lines. The picture along the bottom, along that fence line in Florida, is again, maybe a little more necessary. There's heavy predator pressure for those grazed arrays. So they actually have a fence, kind of a second skirt along all those fences. And I had Caleb, one of our founders, help pose for this picture. He just does occasional spot spraying, and I would say that's the norm for the grazers I talk to, is some spot spraying and maybe some fence line if you've got a real need for it. Lynn, I can pause again if you want to just pose whatever the last question is.
Sure thing, 1 second.
So yeah, what aspect in particular should I focus on? I think we have another 30 or 40 minutes. Oh.
Sorry, this is the first time I'm using this. It's called Ventimeter, and it's not letting me present it, which I think you need to do to log into the spot.
Oh,
So
okay.
Apologies for that. If folks could respond to the question in the chat, that would be super helpful.
Interesting. And I actually realized for the grazers in California, there's some big arrays there that have been grazed for many years. And it's a little bit of a tough nut in California. It is the one place in this country where some grazers have traditionally grazed for free. because of the price of land and other constraints, we really encourage a formalized and professional practice of contract grazing, multi-year contracts, and a fee-for-service plan. So you're going to have to fight that a little in California. Carbon negative energy potential. Oh, yeah. Well, let's do it if we can. So I'm going to kind of go into some more of the infrastructure you're going to find if you do end up doing the managed grazing, and give just some examples of what different people are doing. And just so you're all clear, a solar company might come in, but there's typically a landowner underneath, and it usually stays the same landowner. The solar company who's the developer hopefully will stay the owner, but not always. I'd say like 50% of the time, a developer will sell some point through the process to someone else who's actually becomes the owner of these projects. So what I'm going to encourage folks to do is really work on a structure where they have contracts to protect themselves, and ideally working towards multi-year contracts, because the contracts are sold with the project. So if you've been grazing for somewhere for a few years and someone sells your solar project, you're safer if you have a contract structure, much safer. And I certainly would never do it without a contract. Way too much liability. So infrastructure to manage grazing. The picture up top is from one firm in New York State that's building out all community scale arrays. They develop and own their own projects. So for them, they have an in-house solar grazing program, which is pretty neat and a kind of another angle to think about this. I do know there's quite a few developers now who I think would be, thinking about hiring people for this position. Carolina Solar Services is another example of a firm that has in-house solar grazing operations, and they do operations and maintenance for a number of firms in North Carolina.
Lexie, we're missing your screen share again.
Oh, I do this all the time. Sorry.
Back and forth is rough. I know.
All right. So with the water supply, there's a couple things here. One, there's again, you're not at your home farm. So both that means that at any point, just know that a member of the public will want to see your solar, that your sheep have water. So just mentioning. Also note that if you've got a fixed racking system, I like to keep my water tanks right below the leading edge so that I can get a free refill when it rains. Also know that I'm working with a few systems, and I'm going to get into a couple slides, working with a few companies and with NRCS to think about providing wells and other water access. So thinking through the water access is the big one, and just knowing that the water rights, as many of you are out west, you know this already, but you've got to be, it's a delicate conversation around the water rights, and getting your sheep some water is going to save you. I give a discount on all my contracts where there's already water on site at like a fixed rate per acre. So implementation to manage grazing, a few more pictures to just show the mechanics of how these are 4 different farmers doing this, how they are kind of making it work for them. In all cases, these are farmers who are not the farmer landowners. They have to travel to the sites. And so this is where the farmer has to invest. The farmer has to buy the extra electronet, the extra water tanks, the mineral feeders, whatever. They are investing in the travel time, and you need to budget for that. Again, here are some other just the mechanics of grazing, and knowing that you have to sometimes, manage your flocks while on site. And also know that you have to be able to collect them and bring them home again. So thinking through how to have portable handling systems is absolutely essential. And another just quick one I was saying is you need to both have signage with a phone number on it, contact in case there's any issues, but also, and I make friends with all the technicians on our sites, is you need to have a plan to close the gates. So I'm going to kind of this is sort of, you all know about pasture management already. I might keep, I don't want to run out of time here. Just know that guardian dogs on site are generally, they can be allowed. You'll have to make sure your contract lets you have them. Most grazers do not use them, but sometimes you need them. And so having a friendly or guardian dog is going to be essential. Just knowing here, we've worked hard. We worked with Ernst Seed House in Pennsylvania to develop basically a template seed mix called the Fuzz and Buzz. Here's a solar site where it was drill seeded. We have 2 Fuzz and Buzzes. One of them has more native wildflowers in it and meets pollinator scorecard requirements in several states. This kind of concept of having like an on-the-shelf seed mix that's going to work for the solar companies to just tell their contractors to go out and buy is a pretty good idea in terms of we need our solar companies to be able to go and buy something that's not from Scott's Lawn. You need to be able to purchase something that's just not a bag of fescue. So this is exactly the kind of right group that could think of, we'd like to start doing Fuzz and Buzzes for all of the regions of the United States as a concept. And just know that, you know, they've got to be competitive with, you know, with something when the alternative might be simply a pile of different lawn fescues. On the other hand, sometimes these solar firms are trying to meet biodiversity criteria. And so you have to also be able to balance, you know, their demand for, you know, some native seed or even all native seed. Here's another picture of the Fuzz and Buzz. In this case, in case you're wondering, it had been mown once at the beginning of the season and grazed once, and the sheep had just been put back into this section. So right now, the Department of Energy is the one kind of pushing a lot of, and generally it's an energy industry initiative. USDA and DOE signed an agreement this past year to sort of start talking to each other a little bit more. This, I think, is a lot of the future of solar grazing has to do with when people like NRCS and our extension services start paying attention to the opportunity here. Oops, that was sideways. Well, this is a picture of an NRCS staff person who designed the distribution system for the water, for the grazing at a solar site. And we were able to get a well funded at the site, but then budgeted separately for just all of the distribution. Working with their technical service engineers is absolutely something I kind of see as a strategy. Part of why is because, again, the solar companies don't really have the staff or the expertise. So they need someone like you or someone like NRCS to help them make these sites manageable. Greg, again, to your point about, you know, being competitive on our website, and we have a lot on our website, particularly in the research area. I keep that pretty up to date. This is a National Renewable Energy Lab post. There was a study done that kind of looked at, you know, how do the different kind of agrivoltaics fare in terms of competitive with just standard operational regular solar with turf grass. Just know that in some places you can see, you know, clearing and grubbing, soil stockpiling. Grazers can handle a rougher site terrain wise, so they can developers can save money and they don't have to make it so perfect and sculpted. On the other hand, and these are just estimates, and we actually didn't have anything to do with this study, I'll just say, is that, you know, they were put in a budget for a well at every site. I kind of argue with them on that, but just know that we end up looking, and there's the next one, there's a couple more of these, but basically we end up being, grazers being pretty competitive. We're not an outlier like solar plus crops, and by that I mean like corn or wheat or something where they're trying to do that with PV and raised racking. Solar plus and solar plus pollinator, they consider us reasonably competitive with. Lastly, you know, this is a pretty interesting deep dive into how competitive the grazing is versus on balance versus the other types of solar. And we end up being fairly competitive with standard solar when it all comes out in the wash. So we have some graphs on that. I'm going to directly address the cattle thing. I realize I don't get to it. I do have some other slides. I'll just say two things. Cattle, poultry at solar, and then there's sort of other types of agrivoltaics. With cattle at solar, there's a couple of examples of where this has been done. First of all, there's the dairy farms that have on-farm solar to offset, their chillers and such. Then the cattle can stand in the shade. I consider all that to be fundamentally pole mounted or kind of a carport style. All the wire management has to be kind of very carefully done. It is not cost competitive for your standard solar developer. They will not consider it by and large. It's very, very market driven. University of Minnesota, Dr. Bradley Heinz, H-E-I-N-S, has a test array, a set of arrays where he's working in cattle plus solar. He may get there. Silicon Ranch, Michael Bowdy does have a Department of Energy grant to also look at some of the engineering with cattle and solar. Fundamentally, the racking just has to be taller and maybe stronger. So what that means is that it's more steel, and it means it's more money, and it also means it's more visual impact. So by and large, you're not going to see people designing for cattle friendly solar. I'm sorry, it's just the nature of the beast here. Just quickly on poultry and solar grazing, there are a number of cases from Europe. There's some from a couple from the United States. I think at small scales, people are going to figure out poultry at solar, and there are people trialing it. I think at large scale, I'm not sure how it's going to work, but I think at community scale, you could probably figure out some systems. I think the one thing you're going to really have to look at is really strong perimeter fences, predator prevention, and also birds of prey, and keeping birds of prey out of, eating your chickens. So, and the solar companies have different regulatory compliance than a farmer. So just showing in dry land conditions, I had that picture in Australia. Oregon State has done a bunch of work here, and I encourage you to reach out to them. They're also under our research tab. There's a bunch of good data showing, lamb growth rates. They're looking at, the yields under solar, which are greater in rangeland conditions. So that's why the Australians are liking solar grazing. They already have the sheep, and now they're getting additional grazing. In Oregon, same is basically true. Fewer sheep, but still that additional forage and growth under the panels. You also have this dappled shade on either side. It's not a dark area under the panels by any means. And then the other thing that's key in terms of animal welfare and well-being is a lack of stress. They've looked at sort of cortisol levels in the wool. People ask me what to charge. I have a couple sheets here. Just know that we have a budgeting sheet on our website. Just know that the early numbers out of this is now almost a 4-year-old poll. I think some of this is holding steady in terms of figures, kind of charging in the gross $200 to $300 an acre. I think maybe $400 an acre. A lot depends on the factors I talked about. How big is the array? How challenging is the racking? Is there water access? And in New York, just so you know, part of why New York was so much higher is because New York didn't have anything but community scale arrays at the time it was polled. I don't know why that one's sideways either. So we're kind of going into the can we make meaningful change here? Some things that ASGA does is we've been doing outreach. Here we have a picture of a bunch of our member farmers at a solar site that is grazed, meeting with NRCS, meeting with the solar company techs themselves. I was actually just on the phone right before this morning with one of the other techs at the site who said, I wasn't a fan of the grazing to begin with, but now I've been totally won over because it just works so well. They have better site access. What's actually happening on the ground is that folks are just like, the vegetation management is getting ahead of most of these companies. So the grazers want it and are staying on top of it. And so I've heard now from multiple O&M folks, operations and maintenance folks, that they really like the grazing because they can actually walk around their solar sites. There was an initial study done. I really hope we see more of this on how this can contribute to farm viability. There's a study done by an institute in Maryland looking at, if you have a farm and you lease some of your farm to solar, how that changes your bottom line. We also added solar grazing to some of these figures. So just know that it actually made the difference of the dairies being profitable or not to have solar. I'm now going to just show you a couple of our members and a couple examples from around the country. This was the man and the family I talked about who got out of dairy. He tried all the different dairy. He has a big farm. It's well run, and is now, he's got his first project. He's got his insurance. He's got his first contracts. There's 5 more sites being built, each around 25 acres or 5 or 6 megawatts all around him. And then there's a bunch of utility scale. So he's going in. We did a field day with NRCS at his grazed array. And we're going to hope to get him some water, a drilled well. That was the water picture. We have people here in Pennsylvania who, in this case, Caroline Owens uses dry use only to graze. As you can imagine, with some parasite load issues in the east, that works for her. We have Julie Bishop, who is, I think, something like, she has her 800 ewes, and she's in New Jersey, one of these sites that had early DG solar development incentives. And if you can look at this racking in the top picture, how challenging it is to have these ladders of solar almost on the ground of this distribution and handling systems. 25 acres, 30 acres at a time of lots of wires and cables almost on the ground. So the sheep are doing a better job. She quit her job as a teacher a few years ago and went to this full time. The other angle, and there are 2 big players that I know of in the East doing this. One is in Florida, A+ environmental restoration. The other is Minnesota Native Landscapes. Both of them are working on utility scale solar, as well as a little bit of DG. And these are people who already had conservation grazing as part of their environmental management portfolio, and then have really come on strong in solar grazing in the past few years. And then the reason I'm talking here today, I just want to thank Trent. I was just hanging out with Trent and his family in Missouri like a week ago. Cabriejo Ranch absolutely has been doing, EOV verifications on all their sites, and really just a leader in the industry. So I just want to give them like a shout out. And plus they made a nice lunch for me. And then here we have, finally, this is my grazing business with Lewis Fox. He's a farmer in Vermont, multi-generational family dairy. And I'm based here in New York now, and we're managing, this year we're up to like 550 acres with about 1,400 ewes. So a couple things we have, if you want to do this and you join ASCA, we developed an app that you can use freely and search it, but you can also list your grazing business on it. I'd love more people from the West and Southwest. And just know it's included in membership. You can list your grazing operation, and that way you can be found by solar companies. I do a lot of outreach with the solar industry. I'd love to have, we need more grazers especially in the West and Southwest. Just a few things we've done. We have monthly webinars, which are free. You can sign up. We have a lot of member-only events and education. So just know that we're really trying to professionalize and keep this something where the farmers and these grazers, we have a shot at competing with fundamentally what are these pretty giant operations and maintenance companies, and doing a decent job of it. Just so you know, we just got awarded with Cornell a USDA grant looking at farmer co-ops and looking at both what'll look at both some cost savings around if we all band together and buy insurance together, as well as looking at the marketing of all our products. So marketing lamb, in volume in the Northeast. We have a contract on our site that there's 2 templates for, but if you want to hear about it, we can. If you want to do this, we are updating that this year. Just to give you an idea of who our members are. Actually, we're at almost 400 members now, people all over the world. And we have a law clinic that we work with, and hey, we want more board. We're opening up for a couple more board members in January. And lastly, I'll leave you with something that's sort of futuristic, but in both Ohio and in Canada, you know, there's people now digging into this, which is, can we also make hay at our solar sites? And can we have a system, a certification, or some processes around this? Because boy, that would also be nice as these projects get bigger and bigger. So with that, written profiles, solar wells. Okay. Written profiles. So I don't really have written profiles. We are actually participating in the ASI working group. We are contributing to the new targeted grazing book for them. And that is actually my assignment is to, I just asked one of our grazers yesterday, can you be one of our voices? So we're going to have some chapters in the ASI, American Sheep Industry Association book, the new book on solar grazing and other targeted grazing. Solar wells. Carrie, what do you mean by that?
No, I was just wondering with the equip money, if you can get money for solar wells for your water systems on your under your arrays.
If I can get money for it from
Equip from USDA.
Yeah, so this is that's what I've been wondering too, is and so I'm probably I'm trying to explore that with a couple different projects that I've got little fingers in this winter in 2022. We haven't quite gotten there yet. And so what I've been trying to cultivate and work with are the NRCS folks who understand this well enough to even give it a go. And sort of, I wrote a letter to the Federal Register saying, you know, we really need a solar classification, because otherwise USDA, NRCS, they don't quite understand this, and they have to kind of bend rules a little to accommodate us. But the answer is fundamentally, I'm chipping away at it, and I'd love any advice or help with it. But I have a solar company willing to help this winter with. I have 2 solar companies, one DG, one utility scale, are both interested in pursuing this.
Yeah, and just a 10-second plug is Trent and Cabriejo is also AGA certified. So
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. I don't know what the clean power conferences are, Brian, but you're welcome to send me something later. If you would like to. I don't even know what that is, but I'm happy to. Oh, contact info. Yeah, sure. You know, my easiest way, people, you know, you can write into our just info@solargrazing.org is a pretty easy way to just get started. You can get me that way. I do have, that's the easiest. And success stories written, carbonate, seeding developers, electric offsets, portable electric. Yeah, at large scale, I do have, so at large scale, Dominic, that's a really kind of interesting one. What I'm seeing is, I'm seeing people who are now more, you know, experienced. I'm seeing kind of a bunch of things. I'm seeing developers willing to put in, you know, interior paddock fencing, you know, to break up, you know, I've got some projects in Texas I've been supporting that are like, you know, they're like 800 acres each. And you're like, and most of the time, just so you all understand, in case you don't, like when someone said something is 800 acres, it is never a single fenced area, even out west. It's probably 2, 3, 5 fenced areas already, which is good for grazers. And so what I actually end up doing, there's the interior gates and interior fencing, but what I actually look at first is the perimeter gates and adding extra perimeter gates. I'm doing this little symbol with my hands because I'm trying to get people to understand that if here's 100 acres, here's 100 acres, here's 100 acres, grazers don't want to come back to the entrance, go down to the highway with their sheep, and then turn back in through the next entrance. What we want are the same size gates, but to connect us along the backside. So we can just open gates and move our flocks. So I do a lot of sort of talking to them about flow of livestock and helping them understand that. And that it'll save everyone stress and money. You should also know that the vehicle access to these sites is generally quite good. Because of those those equipment pads you saw, the ones we excluded with our fencing, those tend to be made, they're made off at an electrical contractor, and they are craned in. So you need to be able to get a crane truck in at regular intervals, and those are regular intervals around our solar sites. So you have room to get in there typically with, you know, a full semi of livestock, which is great, especially utility scale. You start having these efficiencies that the solar's building for themselves. So it's not an ask on our end. Wrapping up, sure. Best time to engage with developers as soon as you hear about the project, the minute. Bring your business card, invite them to your farm, show them your grazing operation, build trust, absolutely, as soon as you hear about it. And know that if you have trouble reaching them, 2 things. That's why we ended up forming ASGA. That's why I spend a lot of time talking to developers. I know a lot of them at this point. Also know that there is a public process side of this, and so you absolutely can access solar companies through some of that. Go to the town clerk, go to the county clerk, show them your card. That's why I was in Kansas the other day, because grass-fed land producer there was like, I want to understand how we can get we're writing the solar ordinances now, which is amazing. So yes, email is fine. I can go. It's fun. I'm honored to be included and headed off. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you,
Lexie.